Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along this evening. This is the first of our evening webinars. We've just started running for Strawberry Seed Consulting, and I'm very excited to say that we're doing this one under our own banner these days, as opposed to doing it for one of our partners. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the Wathaurong people. They are the traditional owners of where I'm sitting today in Torquay, Victoria. And I'd like to acknowledge the people and wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of their communities who may be with us today. I'd also like to just briefly say that here in Victoria, we are thinking of those in New South Wales and Queensland who are still dealing with floods. We have a few clients up in those regions and we're really thinking of them at this stage. A few housekeeping issues. If you do have any questions as we go along, I encourage you to pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and there'll be plenty of time to answer them towards the end. So let us begin. So first of all, I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit about Strawberry Seed Consulting and who we are. We are a boutique HR consulting firm that works with small to medium businesses right across Australia, across a whole range of industries. And essentially, we're there to help small businesses navigate their people issues and help them set up structure and process around their people. Today, we're going to talk about getting ready to hire. And really, it's one of those things that I think a lot of business owners, particularly sole traders, don't think about a lot before they actually take the plunge. And certainly we work with a lot of clients who call us and say, I've just made an offer to somebody and now I really need to get some things in place. And unfortunately, sometimes we do come across a few little issues that they may not have gotten right in their offer and they have to go back and fix it. So I think when it comes to business owners, we spend a lot of time and energy thinking about how we're going to spend our money. And whenever we're going to purchase an asset, whether it be some sort of vehicle or it may be signing a lease for a premises, that's going to be a significant investment. So if we're going to make a significant investment in that asset, we put a lot of time and effort into doing our due diligence. We make sure that it's going to fit our needs. We make sure that we've looked at all our different options and assessed them and weighed them up because we're going to spend a lot of money. Yet when it comes to hiring, if wages are not your biggest cost in your business, for most business owners, they're certainly in the top 3. So many times we come across people who just think, gee, I'm really busy, I might want to put someone on. They get introduced to someone, think they seem really nice and they hire them. Yet hiring the wrong person can do a lot more damage and take up a lot more of your time than getting the wrong vehicle that maybe doesn't have quite the capacity you thought it would. So today I want to go through, I guess, the process we encourage people to follow when they are starting to employ and getting ready to employ. But this also, a lot of what we'll talk about today will also apply to existing businesses that maybe have already started down that process, but just want a bit of a reminder of some of the things they could be doing better. So how do you know it's time to employ? Well, there may be too much work and just not enough time for you to do it, particularly when you're a small business owner and a sole trader, because often we start a small business to provide a job for ourselves. We're good at what we do and suddenly we find ourselves with a lot more work than we thought we would. And you think, well, maybe it's time to hire. There might be external factors that are forcing you to change the way you run your business. That could be something to do with the market. It could be technology. COVID-19, whilst it may have a detrimental effect for a lot of businesses, it certainly also had a booming effect for a number of businesses in some industries. And we've certainly got a few clients in that space that found themselves with unexpectedly this whole new market of people, and they had to really quickly try and ramp up and find new staff. And some people just have a vision about wanting to grow their business, about wanting to build a team and build something that's bigger than themselves. So before you start down the path of wanting to manage people, I often suggest that maybe think about what sort of experience you've had in the past in managing employees. Many small business owners have never managed people before. And it's something you want to think about where your expertise level lies, because it would be worth investing in doing some training in yourself before you step into that role, because there's a whole lot of things that people don't expect when it comes to managing people. How well do you understand your legal obligations? And certainly today we'll talk about some of those, but you need to understand the legal obligations of employment. We, for example, sometimes talk to cafe owners, and when we tell them what they have to pay, they go, I can't afford to pay that. That's something they should have looked at before they actually went down the path of employment. Have you thought about the time it takes to recruit and train and actually manage those employees? Sometimes when we're dealing with tradesmen, they'll ring us and say, I want to put on an apprentice. And if it's their first employee, I often ask why. Because if they're really busy and they have heaps of work, hiring an apprentice is someone you have to train. And whilst it might be cost effective because they're not very expensive having an apprentice, you've got to invest a lot of time and effort that you probably don't have to actually training that person. So sometimes it's better to hire a really experienced person who can hit the ground running in your business, take some of that load off you before you go down the path of hiring someone who's younger and less experienced. So it's really important to think about that before you start hiring. And have you considered the challenges of managing staff? Not everyone is suited to it. Not everyone enjoys it. I've worked in HR for 25 years, and in my corporate life, I often came across managers that had been over-promoted. They thought the only way to, I guess, further their career is to become a manager, and sometimes they hated it. You know, they didn't enjoy the experience. So, you know, really think about whether or not you've thought about what that will mean, because often managing staff is going to result in a lot of your time taken up with people. So in terms of understanding employment law, I often like to come back to the basics. And even as HR practitioners, we sometimes come back to the basics, because you have to understand the laws that underpin our employment system in Australia. The first layer within our system is the Fair Work Act, and that is legislation that covers employment across the country, and it applies no matter what you do, what industry you're in. Anyone who's an employee in Australia is covered by the Fair Work Act. The Fair Work Act contains national employment standards, which are essentially the 10 commandments, I call them, of employment in Australia, and they set the minimum standards for any employment relationship. The next level is an industrial instrument. Now, in the majority of cases, that is going to be an award, or it could be an enterprise-based agreement. And generally, majority of people in Australia are covered by one of these, though there are some industries that are award-free, or some professions that are award-free, such as accounting or human resources. And the third layer is an employment agreement or employment contract. And this is a document between employer and employee that sets out the contractual arrangements of that agreement they've made in how they're going to work together. Now, it's really important to note that each layer cannot be less than the layer before. So an award is going to be at or better than the national employment standards. And a contract arrangement has to be at or better than the national employment standards and the award or enterprise agreement that applies for that industry. Now, if there is no award or enterprise agreement, it's just the NES and the contractual arrangements. So what are the NES, or the National Employment Standards? They cover the basics of what defines a lot of things within our system, such as 38 hours a week is considered full-time employment, different types of leave, ability to request flexible working arrangements for primary school below-age children, notice of termination and redundancy, things like the Fair Work Information Statement. It is the minimum standards for employment within our country. Now, when it comes to industrial instruments, they often refer back straight to the NES. So, it's quite common to find clauses on leave that will say, we just follow the NES. However, that's not always the case. And industrial instruments generally, specifically awards, will cover either a profession or it may cover a particular industry. For example, we do a lot of work with allied health, and that is covered by the Health Professionals and Support Services Award. Now, that award covers everyone who works within that industry, or almost everyone that works in that industry, practitioners across a whole range of allied health, as well as their administrative staff. However, if you work in a trade-based business, say you're a builder, you are probably covered by the Building and Construction Award. That award only covers employees who work in building and construction. It doesn't actually cover clerical employees that may work in that business. They would be covered by the Clerical Award, or the Clerk's Public Private Sector Award is actually its full name. So if there may be multiple awards that cover the employees in your business, and it is incredibly important that you understand what they are, because these awards look at things like the different classifications of employees that are covered, what their minimum wages would be at the different levels, what sort of breaks they're entitled to, penalties, leave loading, allowances, minimum hours per shift, a lot of details specific to that particular industry. And you are required by law to follow these as a minimum standard. So it's really important to understand which one actually applies to you. Now, the employment agreement is sometimes called an employment contract. Sometimes it's called a letter of offer. I've had people tell me that they're different things. To be honest, any written agreement that is between the employee and employer where they have agreed the conditions of employment is going to be considered an employment agreement. Now, it may contain variations on the minimum employment conditions that are outlined in both the NES or the industrial instrument, but any variations must be more beneficial to the employee. So, you know, it can't be, you can't sort of take away some entitlements, but they might be at or better than, or, you know, so there are ways you can vary it, but, you know, the better off overall test has to be applied to say, is the employee better off on these varied conditions than they would have been under the award? Now, there may be also conditions or clauses that are not covered in the industrial instrument, and this is where an employment agreement really comes into its own. If you are employing someone and they are only getting the exact minimum in the award, you actually don't technically need to have an employment agreement. As long as you're following everything that's in the award and the NES, you don't legally need a written agreement. However, there are a lot of things that can be covered in an employment agreement that are not covered in these other areas, and we'll touch on those in a moment. And one example of that is probationary period. A lot of people are under the impression that a probationary period is a legal standard. It's not, it's a contractual arrangement. In terms of a probationary period under the Fair Work Act, it's actually a minimum employment period. If you have more than 15 employees, that would be 6 months. If you have less than 15 employees, that is 12 months. And that is a period of time to qualify to make an unfair dismissal claim that gives smaller businesses or larger businesses the time to assess whether an employee is the right person without having to go through a huge process if they're not. Now, a probationary period is often something that is linked to something such as like notice in terms of termination or something like that. So that's where a probationary period is really beneficial. However, it's also good, I think, to tell an employee that they are on probation for a period of time and that you will be assessing. So what should you have in the employment agreement as a minimum? It should at least contain the position the person has applied is being employed for, the start date, the type of employment, are they full-time or part-time or casual, an industrial instrument that applies, ordinary hours and days of work for a full-time or part-time employee, pay details and remuneration details for a particular person. Sorry, I hope everyone can't hear my dogs barking in the background at something. The joys of working from home. Leave entitlements. So a lot of times an employment agreement might just refer back to the National Employment Standards or the award, but there are times when you might vary the leave entitlements. You might offer additional leave, for example. And termination notice periods. Again, you can offer more than the minimum termination notice period. That is completely acceptable to do that, and that is often covered off in the employment agreement. It is important to note, if you do offer more than the minimum standard, then whatever you offer, so say, for example, you offer 1 week during the probation and then 4 weeks notice, that goes both ways. So if you offer more than the minimum standard and you have signed that off in an agreement, even if you decide after the probationary period in less than a year, if that was under the NES, that would be 1 week notice. But if it's 4 weeks in the contract will be what stands. So there are also some additional clauses that we certainly have as standard in the contracts we put together for our clients. The first of these is an offset clause. Now, we spoke just before about the fact that you can pay above award rates. For example, you might pay a flat rate that includes things such as leave loading, which might be in the award, or you might want to pay a high flat rate that can offset some penalties for overtime and things like that. If you are going to do that, you need to have an offset clause in your employment agreement, because that offset clause will say for the amount that you're paying above the award, it is being used to offset other entitlements that may otherwise be applicable. And if you don't have that, someone can actually come back and claim those things for you down the track, regardless of how high you're paying. Conflict of interest is one that came up for us literally in the last week. And this is about having a clause that says that employees must disclose any potential conflict of interest with you, and also that they must let you know that they intend to take any secondary employment and have written permission to do so. We've certainly got an issue with that at the moment with one of our clients, and where that clause is become quite significant because someone has taken some started their own business. Intellectual property is an interesting one. Most people don't really understand it, but a lot of it comes back to the fact that when you create something during the course of your employment, it actually it belongs to your employer. So you might create a great resource that is used. You can't just take that when you go and say, well, I made it, it's mine, I'm going to use that at my next employer. If you've created it during the course of your employment, it is owned by your employer and they own your intellectual property. Again, this is a clause that we have used in helping an employer defend a claim from a former employee. Confidential information. This is an area that we often cover off in multiple areas. We have something in the employment agreement. We usually have a policy, and often we also have an separate confidentiality agreement, because you really want to protect confidential information in your business, and you want to ensure that your employees understand what confidential information actually is and the value that that might have to your business. And the final one is a restricted covenant, also known as a restraint of trade. This is a really interesting clause. Most employers do want to include it. And essentially this is a clause that says if you, when you leave your employer, that you are restrained from taking up, employment, say, or starting your own business within a certain distance, or contacting employees or clients. Now, it is a difficult one to enforce. You have to actually legally prove that you suffered a loss, but it is a really important one as a deterrent. And certainly things like intellectual property, confidential information, restrictive covenants all apply post-termination as well. So they're really good to remind an employee that's leaving your business that those things are going to still apply. I just want to touch on the fact that once you have an employment agreement in place with an employee, you can only vary that when there's been a consultation between the parties. The changes are mutually agreed upon, and variations remain still within the scope of the award or the industrial instrument. All variations must be agreed in writing and confirmed in writing. You might have a great conversation with the employee. They might come to you and say, hey, I want to move from part-time to casual employment, or I want to reduce my hours, or I want to now I'll go from part-time to full-time employment, and you might agree to it, but you should confirm that in writing. And also in that case, actually ask the employee to request it in writing. It is really difficult if down the track someone says, oh, that never happened, we never had that conversation. The burden of proof will always be on you as an employer to prove that it did happen. So always confirm any discussions that you have with your employee, particularly around this in writing. And I would also recommend issuing it to them in a letter and actually having them sign it off. So a few other documents you might want to consider before you start. I mentioned the Fair Work Information Statement under the NES. That's actually a legal requirement for businesses to provide this to new employees. It gives them an overview of the minimum conditions of employment under the Fair Work Act. There is a casual version of that now that is out there. And we come across so many businesses that don't realise that this is actually a legal requirement to hand it out. So that's really important. As I mentioned, you might have a separate confidentiality agreement that's a bit more detailed than what you would have in the contract. I really think the employment agreement or the employment contract should just represent the conditions of employment that you've agreed. And then you can have these other documents, you can have policies and things that actually contain a lot more detail separate to that. so that you don't try and mix them all up in one document. A pre-employment medical declaration can be a really important document to use, particularly if you work in an industry that's quite physical. Essentially what you're doing is you're saying to a potential employee, this is the job we're hiring you for. Here are the physical and psychological requirements of that job. And can you please declare upfront any pre-existing conditions you might have that might need some adjustments or might preclude you doing any part of this job. It's really important, particularly with physical work, because then if someone does have a pre-existing condition, hopefully they tell you, and then you can take that into consideration when structuring their work. But if they don't tell you and they exacerbate that injury, it can actually protect you from a claim down the track. Another good document to have if you have vehicles in your business is a vehicle use agreement. This is quite a detailed agreement that talks about, you know, what are the obligations you're taking on by driving a company vehicle, particularly if that's your vehicle that you're using for personal use. What are you agreeing to? What are the obligations of both parties? Another one we use quite a bit is a training agreement. So sometimes, for example, a trade might bring someone on and there's specific skills for their industry that are very hard to find, so they might pay for an employee to get those skills. So they might agree to pay for that up front, and if the employee stays for 12 months, then you know it'll be covered. But if they leave in that first 12-month period, they will be required to pay it back in part or in full. You would outline that in a training agreement. An incentive agreement is another one. We often see people include things around bonus or commission or in structures within an employment agreement. Again, that's the employment conditions. We would highly recommend that an incentive agreement is kept separate, because often there's a start and end time on an incentive agreement. And, you know, then you can sort of review it without actually having to renew the contract of employment. And another great one to do, and look, you don't need a formal document to do this, but having an induction checklist. What are the things you need to give to your new employees? What are the things you need to get back from them signed? What are the sort of things you want to cover up on them in their first few weeks? What do you need to get prepared for them? Make yourself some sort of list so that you're prepared for them to come on board. Another area which I think is important to have, particularly, not just because I'm a HR consultant, are HR policies and procedures. I like to refer to these as how we do things around here. I'd love to think that people have common sense. 25 years in HR has actually shown me that that is not the case at all. So by having policies and procedures, you set the standard of expectation around conduct and behaviour, for example, so that everyone's on the same page. People often have a different understanding of things, and, you know, it doesn't come out until there's a conflict. And so we see a lot of conflicts come about because people have a different understanding. So having some clear policies around things like a code of conduct. What are your behavioural expectations? What are the standards around OH&S? Bullying and harassment, policies in IT around things like the use of email and internet, social media. We saw a lot of things in the media over that in the last couple of years. Israel Folau was a really large case in the NRL. Mobile phone use, overtime, leave. There's a whole ream of policies that you can have, but like overtime's a really interesting one. So, you know, we often, for some employers, put in an overtime policy that says overtime will only be paid with prior approval, because sometimes employees that know they can get more money for working overtime, and it's not all employees, but sometimes they just, oh, I did an extra hour here, I did an extra hour there. They know they're going to be paid for it, but you didn't actually approve it. So you need to put in policies that make it clear, hang on, I'm happy for you to work overtime, but I'm not going to pay it unless I've approved it. You don't get to pick and choose what extra hours you do. So I've used HR policies and procedures on several occasions in recent years in terms of some fairly serious terminations where employees had breached a number of policies and procedures. And it's much easier to manage a situation where you can say, well, we were very clear on our expectations, you didn't follow them, here's where you've breached them, and they really do protect you sometimes. Okay, what else before we start? We're still doing the before we start because there are all these things that you need to think about. This is a particular one we sometimes see people get wrong when they've made an offer without doing any research, because, you know, when you're going to set a salary for someone, you need to understand some things. So minimum wage is $20.33 an hour at the moment. That is set by the Fair Work Commission, and it's set and usually changes on the 1st of July every year. Awards and EBAs have minimum wage requirements. You need to understand where that employee will fall in classification under that award, and you need to understand what that minimum wage is. Now, in some industries, people pay way above the award. In other industries, they sometimes pay at the award. So you really need to understand what that is so that you can ensure you're setting the right amount, particularly if you'd like to set above award and have it offset things like penalty rates or weekend rates. So it's important to understand what that is. But you should also look at things such as market salaries. You know, what are people paying in the market in your area, in your industry to find and attract people? Because we are in a tough market for employers at the moment. Across the country, in multiple industries, it is a tough recruitment market. It's definitely an employees market. And I think this is, well, certainly at Strawberry Seed Consulting, we believe this is because there's a lot of unease out there at the moment. People, we've had a lot of disruption in the last 2 years, and a lot of people are not moving jobs unless they have to. So we're getting a lot less applicants for positions than we would have 2 years ago. And people who are in a job that's sort of steady, who may have in the past speculatively had a look around, are staying where they're at. And so if you need to fill a role, you may need to entice people across. So it's important to understand what others are paying, and professional associations can help you with this, doing your own research, jumping online, and recruitment agencies can also be helpful in that sense. And there's a couple more boring bits, which no one likes to talk about, payroll and record keeping. You need to have a payroll system. I still occasionally come across businesses using spreadsheets. Please don't do that. There is really affordable accounting systems. If you already use something like Mild or Xero, those systems are actually going to allow you to do your payroll really easily. Though I do recommend, if you're not an expert in it, getting someone to set it up properly for you. You might run the payroll every week, but you certainly need to get somebody to set it up right for you, because sometimes we come across employers that have find out that it wasn't set up properly and it was accruing things wrong, and it can be a bit of a nightmare to fix. You do also need to keep timekeeping records, particularly those on salaries. Often think, oh, well, I don't need to do that, I pay a salary. But if someone comes back and says, I think you were underpaying me, and you've got no records of the hours they've worked, how are you going to prove that you were paying them correctly? You do need to have some sort of system of timekeeping. And if you're going to employ, you need workers' compensation insurance. If you don't have it, I mean, most people know this, and often when I bring this up, people say, why would you need to bring it up? I have come across employers that didn't know they had to have workers' compensation insurance. I came across an employer with 5 employees that didn't have workers' compensation insurance, so it's always worth noting. Okay, we've got all of our basics in place. We're ready to take that step. Now we need to decide, are we actually going to hire employees, or are we just going to bring on a contractor? Employees versus contractors is a very complex area. I'm going to briefly go through it today. If you want more information, our April webinar is actually going to be on employees versus contractors in much more detail. So we'll start off by going through what is an employee. Employees are paid for their time. They're compensated for their time. You know, they can be full-time, part-time, casual, apprentices or trainees. They receive payment for their time as wages or salary. They have tax taken out by their employer, the tax office, and they can be directed when, where, what, and how to complete tasks. So there's a lot of control in the employment relationship. Now, when it comes to contractors, they're not employees, and so many people get confused and interchange these two things, but they are not interchangeable. They're two different forms of engagement. A contractor should be running their own business. They definitely need to have an ABN. They should invoice for the work completed, pay their own expenses, insurance, etc. Work for more than one business, control how and when the work is completed. They can refuse work, subcontract the work to other people, and they may provide their own equipment or work from their own premises. Now, we sometimes get people come to us and say, I've got someone I want to put on and they want to be a contractor. That is the wrong question to ask. What is the true nature of the work? Is someone going to be running their own business and working with your business, taking on extra work that you have, or are they going to be working as an employee for you? It's also important to note that the ATO looks at it very differently to what the Fair Work Ombudsman does. The ATO is very much about tax. So they don't want someone saying they're a contractor if they're not really, because they could be missing out on PAYG tax, because obviously there's tax benefits to running your own business. Fair Work, however, are really what they refer to as sham contracting. They're looking at an employee is not being, missing out on entitlements they would otherwise be entitled to as an employer and employee. And there are employers that will say to someone, I want to put you on, but I only hire contractors. You need to go get an ABN. That's risky. There are true contractors and there are really good arrangements. We'll go through that in the next webinar, but we had a judge say if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck in a case a couple of years ago. So if you've got employers and contractors in your business and you really can't differentiate between them, then that may be a risk for you, and it might be worth watching our next webinar. So what are the different types of employment? Full-time employment, ongoing permanent employment, around 38 hours a week. Awards often set out the details for specific industries, what that looks like. There's a whole heap of entitlements around leave, minimum notice, redundancy, other things that do apply for permanent employees. And it could be either a permanent employee or a fixed term contract. So that, there are options there. Part-time employment is actually exactly the same as full-time employment, but the permanent hours are less than 38 hours a week. So they get all the same benefits, but pro rata. There are, under some awards, some minimum hours that a shift must be in lengthwise for a part-timer, but other than that, they can be very similar to a full-time employee. The other way they're very similar to a full-time employee, and this is an area we see people get wrong, is that if a full-time employee does 38 hours a week, works additional hours, they are entitled to overtime payments. A part-time employee that's employed, say, 20 hours a week of their set hours are entitled to overtime payments when they work additional hours. There are very few awards. The Restaurant Award is one of them, but there are very few awards that actually don't provide penalty rates for overtime for part-time employees. And before commencing, you can't treat a part-timer like a casual. Before commencing, you do have to be very clear on what the days and the hours and the starting and finishing times are for a part-time employee. They can be changed by mutual agreement, but they can't be changed all over the place. They do have to be consistent. And the last form of employment I'll mention is casual employment. So casuals generally work irregular hours and days. They can have a pattern of hours for a period of time, but they generally should be irregular. They're not entitled to paid leave. They're not provided to provide any statutory notice in regards to termination. They may be entitled to a minimum number of hours per shift. There's no commitment required in advance on how long they'll be employed for or for the days and hours they'll work. And they also don't have to provide a commitment to you to work. They can refuse shifts without any repercussions. Occasionally we'll ask and we'll talk to a client and we'll say, how is this person engaged? And they'll say, oh, they're a part-time casual. They can't be a part-time casual. They're one or the other. They're two very different forms of engagement, and there are differences between them. So I like to say you can't be half pregnant. You've got to be one or the other. And if there's confusion over which one you are, then we've probably got an issue we need to deal with. Now, there are some risks around casual employment, particularly with long-term employment of casuals, and we sort of see two ways people get into trouble with casuals. The first way is they weren't a casual in the first place. I once had a trade-based business say to me, I've got 6 employees, they're all casual and they're all working 38 hours a week. They're not casual employees, they're full-time employees. They should have been engaged as full-time employees, and if it was ever taken to Fair Work, that's what Fair Work would say. And guess what? You have to back pay some entitlements and differences and things you didn't provide. The other way is they start off as genuine casuals. They work regular hours, their roster changes, they sometimes don't work. But over time, they're a good employee, you like them, they start to move into a more regular shift pattern. They're starting to work with you longer and longer. And the longer a casual has worked with you, there are more things you need to consider if you want to move them on. And you may, if they've really been operating like a permanent employee, you may have to consider the way permanent employees would be terminated if you're going to terminate a casual. So we really recommend that you sort of, assess on a regular basis. I would say every 6 months, have a bit of a look and say, is this person still a casual? And if they are still operating like a true casual, that's fine. If they're longer term and they're in a pattern of hours, you might want to offer them permanent employment. They can knock it back. I would always offer it to them in writing though, so that, you've got evidence that, you have made those offers to them and they've decided to stay casual. So now we're at the hiring part. We like to talk about hiring slowly and firing quickly. We always hope that you don't have to fire quickly, but if you hire slowly, hopefully you avoid the fire quickly part. The reason this slide is there is because I refer to recruitment as an art, not a science. You can put a lot of due diligence in, you can have a lot of layers to recruitment, but we deal with human beings, not robots. If we could test that someone can make 10 widgets every day, we tested it, they can do it, great. But human beings have personalities, they have egos, they have emotions, we can be interesting creatures, humans. So as much as we can put a lot of science into the recruitment process, sometimes it's just really trusting your gut. So we really recommend that you take your time. Hire the best person for the job, not the best person in front of you with a working heartbeat. That can be difficult, particularly in difficult recruitment circumstances like we're having at the moment, where it is a tough market and it's hard to fill roles. And, we see employees get a little desperate and they pick the person that's there. Oh, they seem okay, I'm just going to hire them. Often they're the ones that we have problems with down the track. But they could be brilliant. So we want you to assess against some set criteria and just try and set them up for success. So when it comes to recruitment, how do you set those criteria? How do you work out what you're looking for? It doesn't have to be a really formal job description, though that can be really helpful in employing people. Why does a role exist? Why are you bringing them on? We see business owners that are just like, oh, I'm really busy, I need someone. I'll throw something out on social media and go, hey, I need help. Does anyone want to help me? And they go, oh, I got no one that was good. But they put out an ad and we read the ad and we go, it didn't say anything, like it was really fluffy. Why does the role exist? What do you need them to do? What are the responsibilities they're going to have in their role? What will they be achieving in their job? What do you need them to do every day? And then what will make someone successful? What will help? What does someone need? What key capabilities do they need to help them actually perform in that role? What skills, what knowledge or experience? Do they need to be experienced? What can you teach versus what you need someone to come in with? What's desirable, what's essential? Now, qualifications can be essential. Someone might need a working with children's check. Someone might need a vaccination. That's a really, big thing that we're dealing with now. But, we have some employers that are like, we're in a really niche industry. We can't hire someone that has exactly what we need. So then you have to think about what are the things that you can't teach that are going to make them successful in that role. Do they need to be incredibly organised? Do they need to be someone that has great attention to detail? What is it that's going to help them? One of my bugbears is seeing the words hardworking and punctual in job ads. Nobody is going to tell you that they're not hardworking and punctual. Even if they're not, they may not be aware that they are, but they're not going to tell you that. That's not a criteria that would make me want to, hire someone. You should assume those things and ask for things that, if you say, the more detail you provide for a job, the more likely someone will select themselves out if they're not right, but then also more likely they'll recognise themselves and go, that sounds like me. I'd also like you to think about discrimination though. You cannot write things in a job ad or in a job description that are discriminatory. You cannot specify age, race, gender. I mean, there's a whole list of things you can't ask for. You can't say, I want a young person or I want an old person. You need to specify what are the right criteria for the role. So where are you going to source them from? You can do the recruitment directly yourself. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We've got a great article on small business recruitment on our website, but it's time consuming. It can be quite time consuming to do it properly. So you can get jobs out there. There's free job boards, there's paid job boards, there's a whole range of places that you can be promoting and advertising for roles. Recruitment agencies, we're not a recruitment agency, we're a HR consultancy, but we do have recruitment services specialised in small business. So we do help a lot of our clients to source their employees. And often we have, I guess a skill base that you may not have. Some clients hire us to help them with recruitment because they are just time poor. They could do it themselves, but they're just too time poor and they just want to be given a couple of candidates they know are right. Others actually engage us because they don't have the expertise. It's not something they've done before. They're not good at it, and they could spend 3 times as long as us putting something together. So, you know, we've got clients that engage us for both reasons. Never underestimate your network. The more people know that you're looking for someone and what you're looking for, not that you're looking for a new employee, but you're looking for a new office manager that's got some experience in building and construction, or you're looking for a new receptionist and she's got a medical background, that would be brilliant. It's a part-time role, it's 20 hours a week, it's in school hours, do you know anyone? The more specific you are, the more likely someone will actually, like in a job ad, the more likely someone will think, oh, I know someone like that, they might be great. And also don't underestimate social media. When it comes to advertising jobs on social media, we sometimes find that you may not get it in front of the person who's looking for the job, but you might get it in front of their family and friends. One of my employees, I advertised for a role and she wasn't even looking, but a friend of hers read the ad, saw it on Facebook, read it and tagged her in it and said, you should look at this job, this is you. You know, I particularly love with tradies. I have clients say, oh, we don't want to put it on social media. The tradies aren't on there. I'm like, yes, but their wives and girlfriends are, and they've been listening to them whinge about their job. So they may be the one that sees the ad and, you know, points them in your direction. When it comes to interviewing, you need to look at, do they meet the selection criteria you've set? If you, as I said, it doesn't have to be overly formal. What are the criteria you're looking for? What will you need to teach this person? Often when we're recruiting, we don't, our job description is what we refer to as our magical unicorn. It's our ideal. In an ideal world, this is what we want. We sometimes have clients come to us and say, we want the person who can do all these things. And we go, that's great. That's actually 3 different people. It's people with 3 different skill sets. So let's work out the one that's most important. What can we teach them? Even HR and OH&S roles, where most people think are interchangeable, they're 2 different streams, they're 2 different skill sets, and you'll often get a HR person that has a little bit of OH&S or an OH&S person that has a little bit of HR. What is your main focus? What are you willing to teach them? Will they fit in with the culture of your business? You know, interpersonal skills, you know, do they seem like a really uptight person and you're really laid back? Particularly if it's your first employee, you're going to spend a lot of time with this person. Sometimes we have clients that are recruiting and they'll say, oh, you know, this person seems okay, I'm not sure, but I need someone. And I'm like, you know, it's like asking, you know, it's a bit like dating, I think. You know, recruiting can be a little bit like dating. You have to ask if you're in love, you're not in love. So when it comes to hiring, if you're not sure, maybe keep looking, because I know, particularly with a number of my employees, I was like, I could almost offer you this on the spot. If, you know, I make sure I go do my due diligence because, you know, that's what I should do, and I know that. But, you know, I just knew they were the right person when I was talking to them. And that's the feeling you want, particularly in a small business. The candidate's goals match what your company can offer. Now, this is not always going to be the case, particularly in a small business. You may not be able to offer someone what they want long term. If they want to have this long, industrious career and you don't have the ability to offer them much more than, you know, the next couple of years, that's okay. But you need to understand that. We sometimes get asked how we can hire people who stay. I'm like, well, maybe you hire people who are the right fit for you and provide them with a great working environment. They'll stay for as long as works for them personally. No one is going to treat your business like you do. But, you know, if there's a real mismatch, it may not work. They may not stay. They'll look for the next opportunity. They're just looking for a job now until they find their dream job. The other thing is, I'd rather have a fantastic employee for a couple of years than a mediocre employee for 10. So even if in some industries, particularly with some of our regional clients, they struggle to keep people. But I'm like, were they a great employee for 2 years? Fantastic. You've got 2 years of a great employee. In a tough market, sometimes that's better than nothing. And maybe they will like it and stay. I've seen businesses not want to hire graduates because they, you know, particularly in regional areas, because they get a job, they work a few years and they go back to the city. That's okay. You've still got a few years out of them. You've contributed to the industry, and maybe they'll come back with their family later on. And it's really important to assess the technical and interpersonal requirements. In particular, in technical industries, we see, you know, they hire on technical. All they care about is technical. But when you ask them why someone hasn't worked, it's often not the technical, it's the interpersonal skills. It's their ability to play nicely with others, it's their organisational skills, it's their attention to detail that have meant that they weren't the right fit. So you need to assess both during your recruitment process. Now, when it comes to onboarding, we mentioned the induction checklist earlier. Set yourself up an induction plan. What are the basics of the what, where, how, when, and who? You know, who do they need to meet? What do they need to understand? If you're a sole trader and you're hiring your first person, I can almost guarantee that you have everything in your head and you're now going to try and dump it on this person. So start early writing out. Start early writing out procedures and processes, and really make sure that you know, you're documenting what's in your head that you want this person to do. What are the is there any OH&S issues in your business the person needs to know about? Think about them up front to make sure you go through them in fine detail so that, you know, you cover all your safety obligations. If there's more than one person in your business, you can always divvy up who's going to do the training. If it's just you, you want to have a bit of a plan so that you don't, and you also want to bombard someone on their first day. One of my biggest tips with employment is don't start someone on a Monday. If that's the first day of your week, don't start them the same day as you, particularly if you come in on a Monday like I do to 40 emails that have been sent over the weekend by small business owners. Start someone later in the week. If you start someone on a Thursday and they work Thursday and Friday, you go through a whole heap of induction. Monday, they might be able to come in ready to work. And organise what they need. Don't have someone come in on their first day, you haven't, you know, if you've got systems, set up their sign-on, make sure they're ready to go, have all their stationery, have their computer, whatever tools and equipment that they need, make sure that they have that there. Have it there ready and willing to go. Go through the position description with them, make sure they understand the expectations, and have a bit of a training plan. If there are a lot of things you need to go through with them, write it out so that you don't miss things. And, you know, all of these things will help set someone up for success and hit the ground running a lot quicker. In regards to managing employees, I'm not going to go into this in a great deal of detail. We will go into some of these things more in future webinars, but there's three things we generally talk about: expectations, boundaries, and accountability. If you set someone up with clear expectations on what you want them to do in their role and how to do it, if you set up clear boundaries around, you know, particularly on things like working hours, are you really flexible? You might say, hey, I'm happy for you to work from home. And then you go, oh, this person never comes in the office. But did you say, oh, look, I'm happy for you to work from home, but you need to come in at least 2 days a week? They're boundaries. Set some boundaries. Where's their responsibility end? You know, where do they need to seek out permission before they do something? And if you set clear expectations and you set clear boundaries, you've then got something to hold people accountable to. And it really makes managing employees so much easier. And often when we have issues come to us, the first thing we explore is, were there clear expectations and boundaries? People don't know what they don't know. And unfortunately, we don't all look at the world the same way. So what that means is that people have very different interpretations of things. Common sense does not exist. 25 years in HR has taught me that. So, you know, make sure the more clarity you give people, it takes out all that grey area and it removes a whole heap of conflict that doesn't need to be there. So my key takeaways for today: plan ahead, understand your obligations, hire slowly. We might cover 5 quickly in a future webinar, but we prefer that you just hire slowly and get great people. Set them up for success. Don't just point them to a desk and say, there you go. And don't avoid the hard bits. You know, some of these bits are not easy. They're hard. You can throw up your hands. And if you need help, seek out help. Now, as I mentioned, our next webinar will be contractors versus employees. Do you understand the difference? And that will be held on the 27th of April. We'll certainly be promoting that out. Tanya Cross, the Managing Director and Principal Lawyer from Cross the T, she's who we often refer our clients to when they need a contracting agreement. So she's going to go through the whole side of contracting in a lot of detail, and then I'll go into a lot more detail on employment. Now, I'm really happy to answer any questions anyone might have. Please feel free to drop any questions that you might have into the question and answer box right there, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. And, you know, I'll be certainly hanging around at least for another 10 minutes to answer them for anyone who wants them. And finally, I will also mention that you can follow us on social media, where we have lots of information on our website about the different ways that we can actually work with clients. And we also have what's called a starting to employ package that is aimed at small businesses that are hiring their first person. We've kept the pricing on that the same for the last 5 or 6 years, and that's 900 plus GST. And anyone that has been to the webinar today will be able to use the code we've got there on the screen, webinar 1, and if you mention that when you're looking, you'll receive a 10% discount on the starting to employ or any of our other packages, and that will be valid right through to the end of June. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Nobody wants to put their hand up unless someone's put them in the chat? No? Nothing else I want to ask about anything? Well, they've got me here. Oh, one coming up in the chat. Oh, awesome. Someone said, thank you. I have a meeting next week. That's fantastic. Look, we love to talk to new clients. We offer an obligation-free meeting with all new clients where we can discuss what your needs are. And if you do need us, we will be, as I said, we are going to be doing monthly webinars. We will be advertising them. We'll be sending some information out on them. If there's any topics that you would like to see in a webinar, please let us know. You will receive a copy of both the slides from today, but also we will send out a copy of the actual webinar itself, and we'll be popping it on our YouTube channel as well. So if no one's got anything else, I'm really glad. Thank you so much, guys, for commenting that that you found it useful. I'm really glad that you had, and hopefully we'll see you at some future webinars. I will stay online for another 8 minutes if anyone wants to ask me anything. Thank you.